going to take us through some of the findings of your research now.
I'm from Eaves, which is a London-based organisation. We've been in existence for about 30 years, and we have kind of 3 areas of specialism, very much overlapping areas of specialism, which are prostitution, trafficking and sexual violence. And you may know us as the organisation who runs the Poppy Project. We're quite well known for our work around trafficking. So as you can probably hear, I'm not from London, I'm not from that part of the world. I'm actually from Dublin myself, and I'm having worked for Eaves for about 5 years, and I'm still there now. I am actually now Dublin based. So it was a delight. I want to thank Sarah and Ruhama for inviting me to speak today. It was a small joy because I got to get the Lewis instead of a Ryanair flight to work. So that was pleasant, but much more importantly, because, you know, I really support the work that Ruhama is doing, and certainly we at Eaves do, and we can see a lot of parallels between the work that Ruhama does in terms of supporting women to exit and the work that we do in Eaves through LEA, which is our London Exiting Advocacy Project. And I'll talk about some of those kind of models of work as we go on through the presentation. I'm talking about this study, Breaking Down the Barriers, a study of how women exit prostitution. We are a matter of weeks, I think, away from publication, finally, after quite a long haul, a number of years. I'm disappointed because I'd hoped to have it for you today, but we're literally at the stage of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, so almost there. Watch this space in terms of final publication. But I will be talking about a lot of the content of the report now. So the study was a collaboration between Eaves and London South Bank University. Always helpful and useful to have some good academics on board as a voluntary organisation when you do a piece of work like this. We had a 3-year grant, a very generous one from the Big Lottery Fund. As a researcher, of course, we're always concerned with ethics, and we had a number of layers of ethical approval for this study, particularly on an issue that can be, you know, quite sensitive, involving interviewing vulnerable, in many cases, vulnerable women. So we had ethical approval from the Research Ethics Committee in the university we were working with, and also from a number of kind of NHS bodies based within London. Where Eaves is a feminist organisation, we adopted a feminist methodology and persuaded our academics to do the same. And primarily what that was about is gathering women's sort of life histories. So there was a very kind of flexible interview that allowed women to speak about what they wished in terms of their experiences in prostitution. The interview is very much led by the women and trying to draw their voices and their stories out as much as possible. So it's primarily a qualitative study. And we did collect vast amounts of qualitative data through long and in many cases very intensive interviews. And we did also develop gather some quantitative data, some numbers, particularly through a needs assessment that we conducted with women at the start of each interview. So, as I said, we interviewed 114 women in total, and it was an England-wide study, and I'm proud to say still is the largest of its kind that was being conducted in the UK. So, quite a significant piece of work. We tried to do so many things with this research. We wanted to do everything and know everything and find everything out, but I guess that these are our central aims. Why and how do women exit? So very much an exploration of that exiting process. And what support do women need to exit? So I'm a researcher at heart, and I love my stats. So I'll try not to bore you too much with them, but I think it's important to share with you kind of who our sample was. Not least because it is quite a large sample in terms of over 100 women, to give you an idea of who we talked to and some of the numbers that we drew out of that sample. So we were talking to women about exiting. 43% of our sample were still currently involved in prostitution and 50% had exited. So obviously we're talking about the exiting process with these women, including those who are still currently involved, but many of whom were making attempts to exit, or they're at least certainly thinking about it and working towards it. 65% of our sample were women involved in on-street prostitution, 29% off-street, and just as quite a small section of our sample, 6%, have been trafficked across international borders. The age range, our youngest woman was 19 that we interviewed, the oldest 55. 84% were British nationals, 25% non-white in our sample. So I think it's just important at this point to talk about how we recruited the women to engage in the research. It was primarily through support services that women are accessing. although we did use a range of methods, in some cases we contacted women who advertise as escorts on websites. There was a few women who heard of our study and self-referred into it. There was sort of snowballing where we would talk to some women and then they'd say, oh, I think my friend would be interested in doing an interview too. It was a range of things. But I think it's just important to note that one of the reasons we had a larger proportion, for example, of on-street women is that a lot of our women were recruited through the services they access, and generally speaking, particularly actually in London, it's easier to, the women on-street are more commonly accessing services, women off-street not so commonly. So I think probably just something important to note is that we were saying that our sample is not representative of everyone involved in the sex industry in the UK. That's not the case, and that would probably be an extremely difficult sample to construct. But we do feel that because we reached quite a large number of women with a range of experiences, that I think we could say our sample is certainly illustrative of some of the issues that women face. You know, it has been put to us that, well, you only talk to the women in the worst situation because you talk to all of the ones accessing services. Well, arguably, some very vulnerable women are accessing services, but I suspect on the other side there's plenty who aren't accessing services at all and who we didn't manage to reach. So just something to think about in terms of a kind of background to our sample. So this was a lot of data that we collected through the needs assessment that we did with women at mainly at the start of the interview, and some of it would have come out through the interview itself. I suppose what we're looking at here are some very high rates of vulnerability in women's backgrounds and lives, and a significant number of women facing some serious adversity in their lives. So you can see the numbers there. Very high levels of experiences of childhood violence, and that includes physical, sexual, emotional or psychological violence. A significant proportion entering prostitution before age 18. And then the next ones relate to kind of women's current status at the time of the interview. So very high levels of unemployment, very significant numbers homeless or in temporary accommodation, very high numbers again, reflecting on Sarah spoke about with health problems, and that's both physical and mental health problems. Virtually all women in our sample were using drugs or alcohol in one way or another, some less frequently and more recreationally. So the 59% relates to those who are using it problematically. It was affecting their lives in quite a significant way. And nearly half the sample had a criminal record, and that's a criminal record that specifically relates to prostitution. So again, this reflects on the fact that a high proportion of our sample were on street, therefore are much more, under the focus, I suppose, of the police. So we're talking there about offences like loitering, soliciting, the charming offence of living off immoral earnings, that kind of thing. That was 50% of the sample were carrying a record around like that. This is to say something specifically if we're talking about adversity and the experiences of women who sell sex, looking here at coercion and experiences of violence. So just to describe what we mean by coercion there, we defined it quite specifically in the research as controlling behaviours to deprive women of the rights and resources essential to freedom in everyday life. So these are women that were very directly compelled to be in prostitution and to enter it and to stay in it at the hands of somebody when it was not their choice to do so. So I think quite a significant number, if you see that, look at that figure there. Women had experienced violence at the hands of all sorts of people in their lives, from relatives to drug dealers to care home staff when they were children. But we picked out the 3 Ps, what we fondly refer to in Eaves as the 3 Ps, and we don't mean the usual protection, provision, prevention. Here we mean the punter, the partner, and the pimp. So I've, in terms of lifetime violence, sorry, just skipping back up to that 96%, this was experiences of violence at any time in the women's lives. 86% was those who experienced some kind of violence while they were involved in prostitution. And then coming to the 3 Ps, punter, partner, and pimp, you can see who this violence was at the hands of. So, in the UK, there's a lot of debate about the nice punter, the friendly punter who helps a woman out of prostitution, who reports a woman for being trafficked after he's bought sex from her. But the fact of the matter is that women are experiencing widespread levels of violence from those who purchase sex from them. And that leads me just into my final point here on this slide about looking at on-street and off-street and some of the kind of similarities and differences between those two groups. And I think Sarah alluded to this as well. We actually found quite a number of interesting similarities between the two groups, despite some of the assumptions about how they're very disparate. Women on street and women off street displayed very similar levels of physical and mental health problems in the study. Problematic drug and alcohol use was a particular issue for women on street, but still quite significant numbers, around half the sample who were off street, were kind of involved in problematic drug and alcohol use. And in terms of experiences of violence when involved, virtually all women on street, about 98-99%, had experienced violence, but 75% of women off street had. So it comes back to exactly what you're saying about what goes on in that brothel behind closed doors. Those particular findings for us, I think, are useful because they basically call into question the common assumption that women off street are safer and happier than their on street counterparts. Oops, my slides are going crazy. Barriers. So essentially, we were talking to women about exiting, whether they'd been through the process or whether they were thinking about it or attempting it. And they described to us the factors in their lives that make exiting particularly difficult, either now or when they had exited in the past. Some women would have experienced one or two of these obstacles or barriers, but lots experienced multiple barriers, and you can imagine and see straight away from this list how many of those might overlap. I don't want to go into loads of detail on each of them, but just to mention in terms of a few, in terms of drug and alcohol and problematic use of drug and alcohol, that was a sort of chicken and egg thing. It was a bit too simplistic to always say, oh, women just get into prostitution because they need to feed a drug a habit. We did have women in our sample who were not using anything when they entered, but had to start using once they got there because they needed to cope. And then we also see women whose use changes over time. So in the exiting process, they may cut down on their crack use, but they replace that substance with another substance like alcohol, again, as a coping mechanism to get them through. High levels of health problems, and I think this is particularly around mental health, women reporting significant levels of stress, anxiety, depression, so not really very helpful in terms of motivating women to try and get out, wanting to make a change, feels insurmountable if you're also facing other health issues. Lack of safe housing options, that was a huge thing for women. First of all, in terms of getting involved in prostitution in order to pay for a roof over one's head, exchanging sex for a roof over one's head, staying with buyers and pimps in order to have somewhere to sleep and not be homeless, and then lots of issues in terms of women trying to get out of prostitution and wishing to exit, but not having anywhere safe to stay or anywhere to go. And I suppose there was some issues with women who ended up being accommodated in the area where they were selling sex, so they were kind of still within their red light district in a way, and that didn't help the exiting process in terms of helping them break away from the sort of lifestyle or some of their peers or perhaps a pimp if a pimp is present. On the other hand, moving a woman completely away to a new area can actually be very difficult and isolating for her, and perhaps break her away from informal sources of support that she had in that area. So I think just really a big thing about addressing women's housing needs. Child abuse and childhood violence and child abuse and neglect, this really relates to just the negative effects that would have had in women's lives, causing issues like dissociation. I suppose what this is about the kind of exploration of women's vulnerability, women who are already vulnerable, drawn into prostitution and exploited further with that kind of childhood violence in their backgrounds, and feelings of low self-worth and low self-esteem, which again really hinder the exiting process. Money was an interesting one. So initially we had classed this as debt, but we realised it was more than just debt. So yes, absolutely, women had debts. They owed money to drug dealers, mortgage lenders, loan sharks, credit cards, landlords. They had run, coercive partners had run up debts in their name, etc. But the interesting thing about this barrier was that it was more common amongst the off-street women, and it related to women off-street in some cases, and we did have some women who described it themselves as escorts in our sample. In some cases, earning through selling sex, earning quite a good bit of money, what they would consider to be good money, but finding it very hard to deal with that money, seeing it as dirty money in a way, wanting to spend it as quickly as possible, So spending it on luxury items and perhaps in some cases, maintaining a relatively kind of flash, high-level lifestyle, but feeling that that was something they therefore had to sustain and therefore needed to stay in prostitution in order to keep sustaining that lifestyle. So it was about difficult relationships, I think, with money, with cash, and dealing with the money earned from prostitution. Coercion included being sexually exploited as a child, but it also included coercion by partners. And I think there's some sort of blurred lines between who's your partner and who's your pimp, and we saw that in lots of cases in this research. Lots of women talking about a relationship they had with a boyfriend who was their pimp, and very much is described as a classic domestic violence relationship in a way, where part of the control of the woman included sending her out to sell sex in order to keep them in, and particularly the partner, in drugs or whatever the money was needed for. A criminal record, which was a key one, which I mentioned earlier, about women having a record particularly related to their involvement in prostitution. And this is classed as a sexual offence, which they carry around for the rest of their lives, and which is shown up in CRB, the equivalent of a Gardaí check, when they want to move on with their lives and apply for work, particularly with children or older people or in health services. Their sexual offences related to prostitution will always appear on that record. So women talked about just feeling like they were punished for the rest of their lives, and what would be the point in getting out of prostitution, because that would always be there before them. Other issues of women being ASBO'd, so given antisocial behaviour orders where they are not allowed to enter the area where they sell sex, which often happens to be the area where they access support, so being ASBO'd away from their support. Some major issues in terms of criminal record. Lack of qualifications, that's just about women having other viable alternatives aside from prostitution in order to survive. And age of entry. We did have some women in the sample who were pretty much unable to remember their life before prostitution because they'd been exploited at such a young age. Exiting involves the kind of formation of a new identity, and some women who'd been in prostitution for so long didn't know where to start in terms of forming that new identity. So it all sounds doom and gloom. These are the barriers, but I have to say that in our sample and all of the women we spoke to, we also really saw some remarkable motivation and determination and resilience. And I think Councillor Corcoran-Kendry said earlier, this is doable. And I think one of the key things that did come out of this research, aside from all of these kind of hardships and adversity that we see the women experiencing, is that exit is achievable, and that women can kind of overcome some of the major barriers and major obstacles and come out the other side. So can you tell me how much time I have?
5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, right. I don't want to say too much about this. Through the course of the research, we developed a kind of model around the stages of exiting, a 5-stage model, which I think does actually have relevance for practice. And actually, our own exiting service in Eaves does use this model in its work with women. The point of it is that exiting is not a single process, and it's not necessarily a strictly linear or rigid one. And we talked to lots of women who would, get a certain way through these stages and then have a bit of a relapse and end up going back to prostitution for whatever reason. And she might be back at stage 1 again, but next time she'd reach a further stage than she had previously. So women can kind of almost dip in and out of these. It's a very flexible kind of model. And it helps, I suppose, in using and applying this in practice, it helps kind of services to tailor responses according to women's individual needs and where they are, what stage they're at in the process of exiting, because it seldom is an overnight thing, in truth. So very quickly, stage 1, readiness engagement, is when women start to feel unsure about their continuing involvement in prostitution, and the disadvantages are starting to outweigh the benefits, and they're thinking, this isn't something I want to do forever. So it's just the kind of initial thinking and gearing up to getting on the path to exiting. The next stage, treatment and support, is when a woman would usually more actively engage with relevant agencies who can help her. So this is where women are making a more conscious decision to move on with their lives and seek support with a view to exiting. Transition and stabilisation is where women are much more deeply engaged with services. They're seeking the help of specialist agencies. They're stepping back perhaps from the lifestyle of prostitution, finding somewhere safe to live. They might engage in more intensive treatment at this time, such as counselling, therapy, detox. Then moving on to stage 4, reconstructing and rebuilding. Rebuilding looks at kind of reassessing women, reassessing the past, and kind of repairing things that have happened in the past, or just making the decision to sort of move on from them and recover. And reconstructing talks about the construction of a new identity and a new role for oneself outside of life in prostitution. So it's about coming to terms with and making sense of the past, but also about self-development for the future. And then that brings us then obviously to stage 5, new roles and identities. Women have made a firm commitment to exit permanently. They have developed a new role and identity for themselves. They've broken away from maybe coercive relationships or peer groups that weren't so helpful for them. And this is where they literally have moved on, perhaps engaged in employment or training. And they've established effective coping mechanisms and have more positive hopes and plans for the future. So I just want to say something, again, fairly quick about models of service provision. We, alongside interviewing women for this research, we also interviewed a range of stakeholders who provide service of all different kinds for women engaged in prostitution. And out of that, we kind of identified 4 different models of service provision. The first is sometimes called the harm minimization plus model. And I should say all of these models helped different women in our sample in different ways. Although the last one, number 4, the case management model, proved, we think, to be the most effective. But just a point on each of them. So harm minimization plus model was very much focused on addressing some of the immediate harms of prostitution. So it's services that provide free condoms, toilets, showers, sexual health testing, needle exchange, etc. In some cases, there were some services that were thinking a bit beyond that immediate harm and starting to think about perhaps exiting, but not necessarily framing the work they were doing as exiting. So maybe talking about what they were doing as positive options for the future. So that was a good thing, but I suppose the bottom line in many of these services is that there wasn't much discussion of exiting as an option. There wasn't really the kind of idea of opening up the discussion of exiting with women. I suppose it was much more about let's deal with those immediate, and it tends to be those immediate physical issues, physical harms that women are facing. So I suppose the ethos of these services is they do address those immediate and mainly physical harms, but there was a kind of implicit message there from some women that once they got their needles and got their condoms, everything was fine and they didn't need to really think any further. We looked at some women's service and women's centre models. They tend to be kind of a place that provides as much as possible a one-stop shop level of support for women, but usually focused on women with vulnerabilities for a whole host of different reasons, and often this kind of service grew up around support for women offenders. So again, providing washing facilities, meals, and some further kind of more structured work with women, and working in a very multi-agency way as well, but quite a generic approach. So these agencies, very welcoming to women, opening arms, opening doors, but didn't necessarily have a specialism around women in prostitution, and therefore weren't, again, really very strongly promoting necessarily the exiting ethos. We looked at a multi-agency partnership model, which is essentially a hub that provides a kind of care coordination role, but doesn't necessarily do direct service provision. So yes, women found that helpful in terms of they could go to one place and be directed to the other places they needed to go afterwards, but women still found that a burden in terms of perhaps having to go to many different agencies and tell their story 100 times to different workers with different degrees of understanding of the issue of prostitution. So that's why we come on to our 4th one, which is certainly the way we operate at Eaves in working with women who've experienced violence. And I think is very similar to the model that Ruhama used, and I think Jane will talk probably a bit more about this, is the sort of case management model where agencies and services in this, working within this model, tend to very much operate from the basis of prostitution as a form of violence against women within that kind of violence against women and girls broader ethos. This is about a woman being assigned a caseworker or a key worker who undertook very intensive one-to-one work with the woman, a risk assessment, a structured care plan based on their needs. This is where some of the reflection of the stages that women are at in exiting could come in. There was an understanding that exiting wasn't a linear process, and that yes, women could sometimes lapse and relapse, but would be supported to get back on the path again. So a lot of interviewees in our research just highlighted how much they valued this all-round support, where they had that trusting relationship with the key worker, and again, didn't have to go and tell their story 100 times to 100 different people, and how much that key worker could advocate on their behalf with other agencies that they were struggling to deal with too. So this case management model did tend to take a very kind of proactive approach to exiting, which women absolutely reported to us they found extremely positive. Okay, I'm nearly there. I just want to say something about a few of the support principles that women told us about that they really, really valued. And again, I feel like, you know, the services of Ruhama and the services we provide at Eaves in London reflect and will be based on these principles. So you'll have heard a lot of this before, but it was reassuring when you're running a service to also hear women say that this is what they want. Tailored support that recognised whether they were considering exiting, was this something they actually wanted to do, where were they along the pathway of exiting, non-judgmental, a safe space, that issue of trust, women really wanting a key worker, a familiar face that they can build up a trusting relationship with, delivered at a woman's own pace and recognising, as I said, the stage she's at, specialist and women only, and this is something that always amuses us at Eaves because we've been accused of forcing our service users to become feminists, and basically being told, oh, you won't let women cross your threshold unless they admit they're a feminist. And I mean, that's not what it's about at all. Loads of our service users will say to us, we really value that women-only space. It takes us away from what we've got going on in the rest of our lives, and is a space where we can start to deal with some of the issues we're facing. So multi-agency links were important. This idea of a one-stop shop, again, women having as many services as they possibly can under one roof. Tackling all the barriers I spoke about earlier holistically. So, you know, not saying let's deal with your drug issues over here and separately let's deal with your housing and somewhere else let's talk about counselling. It was bringing those services together and recognising the links between the different barriers women are facing. Understanding lapse and relapse, so when women exit and then end up back in prostitution and exit again, and acknowledging that's part of the kind of progress and a natural part of the process of exiting for many women. Moving beyond harm minimisation. So this is really key for us, particularly at Eaves. Just ask the question. Have you ever thought of doing anything other than prostitution? So many women come to us in the research and in our practice time and time again and say, I've never actually been asked, did I want to leave? It's never even been put to me in that way. It's never been put to me that there might be a life beyond prostitution. Asking the question. If the woman says no, that's fine, but just raise it. Make an environment, I suppose, where, you know, the issue of exiting can be opened up and there can be a frank discussion about it if necessary and if that's what the woman wants. So this is about, I suppose, presenting some women with a nugget of hope, perhaps, and the possibility of a new future. So I'm just finishing on a couple of quotes from women because the key part of this research was drawing out women's voices. This is a woman who was coerced into prostitution at the age of 15 and exited some 20, 25 years later. She was mainly involved off street. And she talked about accessing a prostitution-specific service in Leeds. And she said, I felt completely understood and not patronised. You couldn't have got it any better, bang on the middle of how I felt. And I'm not just saying that. I came out and I felt lovely, and I didn't feel like it was a chore to relive them horrible situations. I felt slightly empowered, actually, about it, yeah. And the second woman was a woman aged 22. She was still involved at the time of interview, but on the path to exiting, and she was mainly involved off street as well. She said, to have a tailor-made sort of program for yourself, because I think some places try and pigeonhole you quite a lot, and everyone's got a different story, and everyone is very different. And finally, this is a woman who had quite a significant impact on us in the research just because her story was incredibly difficult. She's aged 24 at the time of interview, involved mainly on street, had been pimped from the age of 6 by family members and later by men she'd been involved with in her life. She was exiting, but she was battling a bit and she was in and out, but definitely on the right path, I think. And she said, not talking about it, i.e. exiting prostitution, would be really detrimental. I think it's really important to be given a voice and talk about exiting. Even someone asking you about exiting challenged me in the sense of thinking, oh well, perhaps things could be different. And it did kind of give me that hope. And I will finish there.